Okay. So spoiled that one there. Are you still there, Aaron? Can you speak?
Yeah, I'm still here.
You're still there. Good. Right.
Before you start, I was just about to say, Chris, if you need any of it, I have that, that platform, the anatomy platform.
Yeah.
If you want to use anything, if you want me to show anything on there.
Could you please, whilst I'm doing this, could you get the lower extremity, so the calf and basically the shin, because I've got the, I'll explain what I've done as I go through. Right, guys, cool. So week 6, forearm and calf. Obviously, we've gone through all the bigger muscles. We can't neglect the smaller ones because they are important and probably a lot more important than may seem. They do have a big role in certain mechanics as well. Stabilization roles, etc., etc. Just a quick recap. Obviously, muscles of the trunk from last week. We had the Great British Flag, which was the image that I used to remember the muscles of the trunk. Most superficial rectus abdominis. Then we have the internal external obliques, as you go in diagonally, and then going across horizontally, we have the TVA, and then we're thinking about how we link the muscles of the trunk, the ones that surround the spine, such as the rhomboids, the Splenius capitis, serratus anterior, and they swivel around the body like in the helter-skelter there. So we want to make sure as you're familiar with those things, the concepts, and again, if you need to recap, go on to week 5. But I'm not going to go through the languages because we've got some new ones and new terminology today for you to remember, which makes the forearm and calf a lot easier to recollect. So I'm going to get cracking straight into it. We're going through layers again, and I think it is really cool, the mechanics of it. We've spoken about layers before. There was layers of the midsection, and it goes deeper into, we finally hit the TVA, and then we get the internal organs. The same applies for the forearm and calf. My goal for this one isn't necessarily for you guys to be absolute experts and know every single muscle, but more so just getting an idea of the mechanics, because the mechanics are pretty cool and it'll explain a lot. And it's so clever the way our hands and feet move. It's really good. So a lot of muscles responsible for hand and foot movement. Sorry to say that again. A lot of muscles that help move our fingers and toes are actually found in the forearm and the calf. So when you wiggle your fingers, and if you give your fingers a little wiggle in any direction, there are managers of the hand which are found in the hand themselves. But a lot of the flexion extension that's going on in your digits are occurring through muscles that are a little bit further up. That becomes relevant because when we use our hands too often, or we put them in certain positions, such as typing and texting, that can then impact and pull on different muscles, which are found further up towards the knee or the elbow, which can then impact hamstring and quad if it's the lower body, and also bicep and tricep, and then eventually shoulder. It's probably a lot more common in the upper body, so people getting RSI injuries or getting niggles in the forearms, which then impacts the shoulder function. And just to summarize really simply, is that your supination and pronation of your wrist really does impact your shoulder mechanics, which is very, very important for bodybuilders, especially, and strength athletes, because they get stuck in a certain range and then they lose shoulder function. But the idea is still the same that I've been going on about for the full 6 weeks. Upper body is a mirror image of the lower body. The same mechanics apply, and it's virtually the same. I'd say there's probably, if I go like play for play and look at the muscles, there's probably a little bit more that allows a lot more freedom of movement and dexterity in the hands. But again, the principles are still there. So it's quite intimidating. I've purposely put that there, and the whole point of this is that's just the extensor group, and I would not expect anybody to watch 1 hour anatomy video and be able to go and say those off the top of the head and know every single point, the insertion, origin, action, and everything. It's just not something that is I wouldn't say important as a PT, but it's not something that is probably the best use of your time. Eventually, if you do learn them, then great. But as you can see, there's a lot going on there. And if anybody was to look at that and say, wow, well, there's obviously a lot to remember. So it doesn't really bear much context to training. You would never program extensor Pollicis Longus exercises, or at least I hope you don't. It's not something you'd ever use in context in the gym floor. What you do need to know is that, your grip is important, pronation and supination is important. So you'll train these by default by just training smartly, getting people to train their grip to a degree. I don't really agree with straps for everything. Straps obviously helpful for a deadlift. They can be helpful in other situations, but if you're a person who uses straps all the time for every single pulling movement, I do think that's going to leave you susceptible to elbow pain and dysfunction. But yeah, the whole point is that you understand the principles. Whether you know every single muscle is down to you and how much time you want to invest into it. Like we said, everything is to do with layers. And it's the same principle, is that the deeper muscles, so the ones that are found underneath the superficial layers, they're going to attach more to the bone, to the bodies of the bone of either the radius and the ulna, or the tibia and the fibula. So they're going to be located around the interosseous membrane, which is the gap between those two bones. And they're going to be, they're going in to either the foot or the hand. The superficial ones, so the movers, are going to be attaching around the condyles or the epicondyles. So the gastroc is a really good example there of how it goes into the medial and lateral condyle of the femur. Is the gastroc two muscles instead of one? Possibly. It's just called it's got the gastrocnemius lateral head, medial head. But when we think about it from the kind of the mechanics of the hand, it's a primary flexor of the ankle joint. So the new language, so things to remember. So if you want to really ensure that you take something from today, these are the things to remember. Pollicis is of the thumb. So anything pollicis, it's going to be thumb. Hallucis is of the big toe, or hallucis. What do you go for, Aaron? Is it hallucis or hallucis?
Hallucis.
Okay. So
I think if you're posher than I am, though, Chris. So it's probably hallucis.
Hallucis sounds a little bit. They're all very Harry Pottery. So
yeah, they are a bit, aren't they? Yeah, I've never watched a Harry Potter movie, so I'm not quite sure. But
you haven't? Oh my goodness.
No,
never lived. Anyway,
no, my wife won't let me buy any of the books. She said it's childish.
All right.
That fits, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so pollicis, we've got of the thumb. Hallucis is of the big toe. Digitorum is of the digits or the phalanges. That one, whoever came up with the names, you've just got to be very, very familiar, because you've got your flexor digitorum longus, and you've got your flexor digitorum superficialis, and they sound the same, and you think they'd be in the same region, but they're not. So digitorum is just of the digits, so that could be the phalanges, which basically means fingers and toes. It is unfortunately just one of those ones you've just got to get good at and know which one is where. But then carpi is going to be of the hand, radialis is of the radius, ulna is of the ulna, ulnaris is of the ulna. So that is pretty straightforward in that regard. But carpi, we know it's going to be in the hand. Digitorum is one that you do just need to remember. But hallucis, big toe, pollicis of the thumb. So we have layers of 3 layers of flexors. So we're going to get stuck to it with the forearm. And if you want to think of this as layers of different mechanics, I just think it's very, very, very cool. And if you got to think of it, we'll go to another film reference, which is that of Star Wars. And if you think Luke Skywalker, his hand chopped off and he gets that robotic hand, and you think about how that moves and all the different parts and components to it. The layers and the mechanics of that are basically the same with this system here, where there's the deepest layer, which is the PPQ, and that's going to be your flexor pollicis longus. It's going to be your flexor digitorum profundus, and it's going to be your pronator quadratus, and those are located on the bone. So it's bone to bone, which is going to be originating on the ulna and generally attached to the radius with the can't get my words out now, the pronator quadratus, I'd say. And then with the other ones, they go into the thumb, obviously, if it's of the thumb with the pollicis. But with the profundus, which I think is really cool, it runs all the way up to the most distal phalanges, so the top bits of your fingers, shall we say. And when you are doing anything where you're gripping and bring your fingers towards the palm of your hand, there's a contraction deep, deep down in the muscles that are right underneath all the ones on top. So then above that, we have the second layer, which is the flexor digitorum superficialis, which is what the S is. So that is just going to be, it has pretty much the exact same anatomy, same role as the profundus, but it's on the second layer. and that inserts into the more proximal, so just underneath the phalanges, which are a little bit lower down. So think of it as the second bone, or the joint between the second and third bone of your fingers. So this is this layering sequence with the tendons, which allows your fingers to move in individual segments, and that's coming from the tendons that attach into the fingers, but the muscle is actually located in the forearm, which again, I think is pretty cool. And then on top, we've got PF, or you want a PPF, or it was pass, fail, pass, or whichever one you want to remember. But there's two flexors, and they are, if you think about it, quite easy to remember, because we have our flexor carpi, so which is the flexor of the hand, radialis, and a flexor carpi ulnaris. So one which is orientation more towards the radius, it's on the thumb side, and one that's an orientation more towards the ulnar, which is on the little finger side. The P and P is going to be the Pronator Teres, which originates medially, so it's like more medially on the inside of the elbow and goes across to the radius, and when that contracts, that is going to pronate the hand, obviously, because pronator. And then the final one is the Palmaris Longus, which is another version of that palm flexor, or that hand flexor, which is a little bit lower down, and it's more in the wrist and the retinaculum of the wrist. And retinaculum is a term for a sheath of muscle tissue, not muscle tissue, a sheath of like fascia, which is going to connect a load of tendons in one place. The ones that are most relevant from a clinical, or one that I'll work on, is the retinaculum on the anterior portion of the foot, and the one on the anterior portion of the palm. So ones that are involved in the flexion. So the things that I'd want you to remember is that the more superficial we go, and just to stop the waffle and get to the point, is the more superficial, so the more the muscles are on the top layer, as we go to the highest layer, they are going to insert into the medial epicondyle. So flexors, I should have really written this down, but flexors superficially are going to be on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, so they're going to be higher up onto the bone above that. How is that relevant? Well, if we have an issue and we have a length tension problem with those muscles, because they can't fully lengthen due to being constantly flexed, because you're always on your phone or always on a laptop, you're then going to have that muscle which won't be able to go through its full range of motion. That's going to impact the position of the elbow and the push-pull and the tugs that are going on the elbow joint itself. What you can also find with people who have very, very tight flexors, especially closer to the medial epicondyle, is that then they have a nice meaty adhesion in the lower portions of the long head of the tricep. And that's just because they share origins and insertion points, either which are in close proximity to each other. So the deeper the attachments, the ones that are on the deeper surface are the ones that go further into the hand and the foot.
Can I just jump in there, Chris?
Absolutely.
Are you working from a presentation? Because I think people are struggling. If you are, you can see your presentation. They can just see you.
Oh, no.
As nice as that is.
Has that been the whole way through?
That's been the whole way through,
that's why, because I haven't screen shared. That's it. Should I start again? Right, okay. Let me go. Can everyone see that?
I was trying to get your attention without being rude and interrupting you.
I could have just said from the start there, sorry. So I'll go back to...
Well, I was actually looking for the lower leg for you, so I wasn't on.
Right, so we go through everything. So we've got the extensors there. So it's basically me talking, but same thing. So we've got the adductor muscles. So that's the version that we're saying with all the names of the muscles and everything that's going on. And this is what I was saying with the gastroc. This is what I was saying with the different ones, with the languages that we need to remember. That's what I was saying about the PF, S, and then PP, PQ. If you want to remember these, that is obviously very important. But what I want you to understand is that there's layers that are going on the flexors of the forearm, and it's a similar principle. And if there's dysfunction in this layers because the joint can't move properly, or there's been a restriction in that, it can then impact the structure above because they share the same attachment. Cool. So that is what it looks like from a layers perspective. So the deep ones, so that we've got the flexor digitorum profundus. As you can see, the tendons are going all the way into the distal portions of the phalanges. Then we've got the flexor Pollicis longus, which is the flexor of the thumb, which is going into the tendon of the thumb, as you can see there. So I'm looking to my right, the right side of your screen. And then we've got the pronator quadratus, one of the, I think four quadratus muscles in the body, which is just underneath here, and that's what helps you rotate your hand and pronate it. And it's an end range, helps the radius swivel over the ulna, and it's just underneath that position there. So that's the deep layer. On top of that, we've got the superficialis, which is quite simple if you think about the name, superficial, so it's just on top of the deep ones. And then finally the ones at the top, which are here. Now, if we think about the different things that we can do, if you palpate your forearm and place your hands on the just below your elbow, where the medial epicondyle is and a little bit lower, and then if you move your fingers like that and do that type of motion, and then claw it towards you, you'll be able to feel those muscles pop up, and that's an easy way for the palpation of them. The ones that are usually the typical culprits, it just depends really. I find that you might be able to find it on yourself, but from treating people and seeing what they, where they have issues, is the ones a little bit more medially around here can get very, very tight. And people get a lot of say Texter's thumb. Do you find that, Aaron, where people just got absolutely solid forearms just from?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, and particularly in lifters, people that are in the gym, I think your forearms just, your gripping bars, chin ups, I think your forearm just gets rock solid. It's very difficult to distinguish between, one muscle and the other when they're that tight.
Mm-hmm. So there's the actual knowing what you're on, it doesn't really matter. What we're looking for from treatment perspective is, right, what feels a bit horrible, let's try and work that out and move it. Long story short is that you as well as the flex and extension, so being able to access flexion to a decent level of the extension of the hand to a decent level is going to help stretch all those muscles. But if you look at the fibers and how they go medially to laterally, you also need an element of rotation as well, because all of them will play a role in that to a degree. So one of the things that I found, the more I've started treating people and having to look after my hands a lot more, is to do either a bar or anything really. It can be any implement, a weight, and where you're just doing the rotation from side to side like that. And then the hand that I'm usually treating, or the hand, the dominant hand, will probably be a lot more restricted in either supination or pronation. But it's working on that is really important. And I've had people before who've had long stem and shoulder issues, and they've looked to the neck, you've looked at the pec, and they've released all that, but not paying attention. If you really need to pay attention to everything going around the forearm and the elbow, because that's going to play a role as well. Because if you can't supinate or pronate, depending on what you're doing, whether you're rowing or pressing, you're going to have to accommodate, and a lot of people just shrug up and go like this. So they'll increase they'll increase scapular elevation to make some room in the GH joint, because of the fact that they can't move the wrist around. And one thing that's very, very common is when you get someone pressing and they're like this, everybody should be able to see me in the top screen, but they have one shoulder higher than the other. I'm not saying that's completely down to supination, pronation in the forearm, but it's one thing that could be contributing among a lot of other things. So extensors follow the same trend. We've got this lovely image from Ken Hub. The main difference here is that they just switch. So I think if we just think about the layers on muscles, now we've got the extensor group is going to be, the superficial extensors are going to go into the lateral epicondyle, which is on the outside there. The reason why I think this is something that's good to know, it's a nice little bit of info to retain as a PT, is that if you got people, we go on about desk posture quite a lot, and we're hunched over and we're forward like this. Now with the extensor group, we've got the extensor, we've got extensor digitorum, we've got extensor, as you can see on there, we've got extensor carpi ulnaris, but there are two radialis ones. So there's extensor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi radialis longus, and there's extensor carpi radialis brevis. And the reason why this is of some relevance is that the longest muscle is going to go into the index finger, and then the brevis muscle is going to go into the middle three. So the middle two fingers, middle three. I've got 6 fingers, but they've got middle 2 fingers that go into here. And the reason why this is important is that when somebody's hovering over a keyboard, that muscle is in a constant isometric. So if I was to say to you, you need to hold a weight out to the side and hold it out to your side for as long as you can, you'd probably say, okay, my shoulder's hurting, okay, my trap's hurting, so forth, and lots of other things start hurting because that muscle is constantly under tension. It's by holding your fingers aren't that heavy, but eventually when you're sitting there for hours and hours and hours on end, that muscle is going to get very adhesed, very gunky, and it's just not going to feel that nice, and that can impact maybe your ability to supinate, more likely supination than pronation. But again, long story short, if that one can't move properly, we may lose the ability to fully extend the elbow, which then can impact elbow mechanics because you're not fully being able to lock out the arm, and then you have to protract the shoulder to finish the movement. So little things can go a long way. In terms, again, the extensors, if you want to know the muscles that impact on the thumb, they've got the extensor, because it's the thumb, it's going to be Pollicis, and it's the longus and brevis muscle, which you can see. These muscles, like I say, is that my point here is that if you want to go away and memorize them, that's fantastic. Will you ever need them in gym? Probably not. Will you need them in osteopath? 100%. What I want you to understand is the context that they're there, and the main thing you need to remember is that there are muscles on the superficial layer and the deep layer, which are constantly acting on the hand to counteract things, but they're going to be worked if you're hovering over a keyboard or texting on your phone. When they get irritated, that can impact the elbow, which can impact the tricep and shoulder. Model explanation of the foot. Right, Aaron, do you want to go through I'll pass over to you. You can go through the foot. I've got a little explanation here, but I'll just wait to see. What my biggest worry was with this one was just losing people in terms of if I'm going into all the different minute muscles, because where in some of them we were only learning a few, like learning a bit between 10 to 12. With this one, if we were going to go into all of them, it'd be like, I think there's probably about 30 at least. So if you just want to give
me, can you just give me your, okay, I've got the host, right.
You've got the host now, yeah?
Yeah. So with your lower leg, I think it's actually less complicated. I know there's lots of muscles to go through, but I think it's actually less complicated than it is in the upper limb, because everything's compartmentalized. So when you look at, the thigh, the hamstring groups, you've got your anterior fascial compartment, you've got your medial fascial compartment, you've got your posterior, and it's very much the same in the lower leg. So I'm going to try and draw some some things on here. So in the anterior fascial compartment, which is here, we have an important muscle called Tibialis Anterior. And obviously, if you are one of those people, or your clients are one of those people that suffers from shin splints, medial tibial stress syndrome can be caused because of your overusing the anterior tibialis muscle. So that's clinically relevant, or relevant to you as a PT. You've then got extensor digitorum and extensor Hallucis Longus. So Hallucis is the big toe, Pollicis is the thumb. And that's essentially, in some books, you've got Peroneus Tertius, but that's it. In that anterior fascial compartment, you have 3, possibly 4 muscles. We then move around to the side. So this is the lateral fascial compartment I'm just drawing on here. And in there we have our peroneal group. So you've got Peroneus Longus, Peroneus brevis, and again, depending whether you've included tertius, which is at the front rather than at the side, depends whether you include tertius in that lateral fascial compartment. But essentially, your peroneals are your everters. These are commonly injured when people sprain their ankles. You get peroneal avulsion fractures. So again, if you've got clients who have got lateral ankle pain, the immediate assumption would be you're going to look at the ligaments. The more informed opinion would be you might consider the role of the peroneals and perhaps a tendon injury involving one of those peroneal muscles. Now at the back, we have a posterior superficial compartment, and I'm going to draw that on there. So that is your posterior superficial compartment around there. And in that we have gastrocs and soleus, so our 2 prime movers for plantar flexion. And then we have this little group in the middle, which is your your deep posterior compartment. Now, the easiest way to remember this is it's a mirror image of the anterior fascial compartment. So in the anterior compartment, we've got tibialis anterior. In the posterior deep compartment, we have tibialis posterior. In the anterior fascial compartment, we've got extensor digitorum. In the posterior compartment, we've got flexor digitorum. But essentially, it mirrors. So flexor, extensor hallucis longus, extensor of the big toe. We have flexor hallucis longus. So I think from a remembering perspective, from a memory perspective, the lower limb is actually easier to work out, because if that cross section, if you can memorize that cross section, you'll find that once you understand the location of each of those muscles, it's much easier to then start to work out where and when that people have got problems, where those problems might be arising from. As I say, clinically, you tend to find anterior tibialis and posterior tibialis. When we're talking about shin splints, medial tibial stress syndrome, they're the two most likely culprits. Anterior tibialis if you've got pain on the outside of your shin, posterior tibialis if you've got pain on the inside of your shin. Of the other ones, peroneals, we've talked about with lateral ankle sprains, so don't rule out the possibility they've got a peroneal injury. And then obviously you've got your gastrocnemius, which probably from your perspective, your guys' perspective, it's going to be Achilles problems and maybe mild muscle strains that you might be encountering with your clients. Anything you want to add to that, Chris?
No, perfect. I've got the. Can you see my thing? If I should go onto the camera, I can show them the model and actually spin it round.
Shall I stop share then?
Yeah, if you could do, buddy, that'd be great.
Yeah. There you go. You're back on.
Everybody's on mine. So I was bang on. It's bang on the money there. It's obviously going through those different things, but with the foot in this position, I think what's to help you get your head around that, because the muscles are really they just explain a lot, and you might look at somebody and go, oh, they've got calves, but you learn a lot through your hands, and when you palpate and see where there's muscle bulk and muscle thickening, calves are quite interesting, and they'll tell you what's happening. So if somebody has like a pronation of the foot, they might have thickened something that's going to counteract that or help that. So that's when like the peroneals, which are these like fan ones where it's going longus brevis, and if depending on which textbook, the tertius. So if I'm looking at the foot here, this is the big toe, and we're going out the side, they feather around laterally here like so. And if somebody has an inability to control pronation and ability to go through pronation, and they struggle with hip internal rotation, that's when these muscles may start to be overworking. With the tibialis anterior, it's going to start here at this upper portion. It's going to come through and go through into the medial cuneiform in the first tarsal, which is round about here. So it's going to go medially. So it's in a similar position to the peroneals, or it's just a little bit more anterior, but it's going to go across the foot and then forward into this position here. What I think is really cool about the foot is the thing you said. Have you mentioned it before, Aaron, about the is it the windlass?
Yeah, the windlass mechanism.
Yeah, you were talking about the windlass one. Is with the foot is to see here. One of the things that helps that mechanism, we have this quadratus muscle round about this region, quadratus plantar, and this forms like a tent with the flexor digitorum longus, which is that long toe flexor, which is coming from the upper compartment here, which is going to be more posterior, so near the tibialis posterior. It's going to run through the foot into here and create this little tent, or like round about this region. And then when you pull the toe upwards, you'll have this strength in that fascia and that ability for that to tighten to create stability. With people who don't have the ability to really drive and the strength in this big toe, that muscle along that chain can become inhibited and be very, very painful. And then I can dig my fingers in and find it. And it's quite interesting. Now, if we go down the fascial chain route, which is we're obviously not going to go into too much in this, but that then links to the whole internal, very, very deep layers of the body, such as the adductors, and then further up into the psoas. So that's where, if we wanted to go that deeply, dysfunction in the big toe can then hit everything up the chain, and then it impact your ability to abduct the femur, abduct the femur, hip mechanics and so forth. So that's why everybody seems to be banging on about the big toe and how important it is. That gives you an indication from an anatomical perspective, is that the big toe flexor is going to go through here. It's going to run through the foot and go right through this, and it's going to go up to this region. And again, the same with the ones up through. They go through this ankle region, round the back and then up through this compartment. Again, when we're thinking about the something to remember, a little, I don't know, brownie points, is that for some reason this just wouldn't stick for me for ages, whether it's relevant or not. This is flexion of the ankle, that's extension. Why is that relevant? You know, whether it is or not, is that, so basically plantar flexion is extension of the ankle, dorsiflexion is, no, I got that wrong. Plantar flexion is flexion, dorsiflexion is extension. And that to me helps understand, you know, when I keep on saying it's the mirror image, if you want to think about biceps femoris, so we've got biceps femoris is a flexor, obviously. Biceps brachii is a flexor. If I was to go like this, I'd then flex my arm. If I was then to go flex like this, that's flexing my wrist. So all the flexors in this compartment, so the medial flexors are going to be flexors. This is what your calf is and soleus on the lower body. The reason why I'd say that's relevant is that when we're trying to remember all the muscles in a sequence, that makes sense. That if you were to plantarflex your foot and then you were to flex your knee, that's like the same as doing a bicep curl. And again, this is just a method that I use, but it's how all of those muscles work in sequence, is that extension pattern, so triple extension and then triple flexion. And then you can just think, well, what's working around what, because the mechanics are similar. So, so anything?
And just with, sorry, Chris, just with regards to that big toe, so you need about 40 to 45 degrees of extension through the big toe to be able to toe off during gait. Now, from a PT perspective, you know, you might not be wanting to get your goniometers out on your clients, but if you look at, or get your client to look at their big toe, if they have callus formation, so hard skin, on the inside of the big toe, that tells you that they've got limitations in big toe extension. Because what they're actually doing, instead of toeing off like that, they're screwing their foot round, and they're trying to accommodate that lack of range of movement by creating some rotation. So you can, and then that, you know, I think it's as much as it's popular at the moment, I do think big toe mechanics, ankle mechanics should be your first priority if you're coaching and training people. Because without movements, you know, you start doing loaded carries, you start training legs, you start getting them running, sprinting. I think you're setting them up for potential problems up the chain due to that lack of movement. So callus formation on the big toe, hard skin on the big toe.
Can it lead to bunions as well?
Bunions are caused because you've got Hallux Valgus. So Hallux Valgus is where the big toe laterally deviates. The cause of this is relatively unknown. They do think it's cramming your feet into tight-fitting shoes. So if you look a lot of the celebrities, you know, they might have these pristine bodies, but you look down at their feet and they've got trotters, and that big toe is starting to laterally deviate. And that's called Hallux Valgus. Now, at the first metatarsophalangeal joint, which is basically the knuckle of the big toe, because the big toe starts to laterally deviate and rotate, that bone starts to come into contact with the shoes. That causes friction. And when there's friction on bone, or when there's load on bone, it starts to remodel. And that's what causes a bunion. So a bunion is a bony outgrowth, and it's your body's way to trying to protect you from that constant friction on the bony surface from your shoes or your footwear.
And I'd say so a little off topic, because this again I think deserves weight, even though we've gone through both the forearm and the calf in what is nearly just over half an hour now. To get the understanding of the mechanics, it does take a while to really first know the anatomy, first know the muscles, and get a really good concept of that. But from a practical standpoint, is that if you get somebody to come in, and I don't think I could explain it through that, but you just do a postural assessment on somebody, and they have one foot which has this nice arch, looks pretty strong, and it has it just looks like it should do. So anatomically we can see that there's an arch there they can plant through, and they're on that foot there. and then you have another, and then the other side is just melted in, and we have the medial malleoli, which is essentially your ankle bone, has rotated probably either it can go posteriorly, but it's rotated and has fallen in, and there's a lack of an arch. This is the foot here of a healthy, anatomically, let's say, correct foot. Now, just obviously watch, now you're looking at all the joints around here, watch what happens when that malleoli goes in. So now we have, if you can see, because it's a very robust joint, there's a lot going on there. It's very, very stable if you think about it to some degree compared to the wrist. If that goes in there, that tibia and fibula, as you can see now, has gone in. So it's like, well, what does that's a medially rotated knee, which means that then you might have to do something further up the chain. So as we go up now there's going to be a compensation in the hip to now try and bring it round. So one thing you can see is that people with a fallen arch, so a fallen, weakened foot where it's gone in like that, they have a really bulky, thick tibialis anterior, which is very, very obvious. It might have hypertrophy, or it's very, very tender to touch. So now there's been a change there, because we've had a medial rotation in the knee, but now we've had to compensate that, but constantly attempting to externally rotate in the hip. So then there's like these fighting mechanics just to keep us in sagittal plane. So if you don't want all your clients to go see Aaron, no offense, Aaron, is that this is a very, it's just something to look out for. And even if you just identify it and say, right, we're gonna really focus on this, but just think about loading, because the popularity these days is like, okay, somebody can't squat or deadlift, let's just get them on a leg press. Well, it's the same mechanics, It's the same thing. But they just because they now can't fall over and you can load them up, and you can say, well done, you just beat your logbook because you're on a leg press. The same mechanics are occurring in that triple extension of the foot. So
and I think potentially the injury following that is more catastrophic.
Yeah.
If you can't squat or deadlift, you're not going to be able to load that sufficiently well, whereas they can leg press because you've inverted their body position. As the magnitude of the load increases, the potential for a more catastrophic injury also increases. Yeah, can I just jump in there, Chris? I think when we talk about this on our podcast with the feet, I think for your postural assessments, I think the best thing to do is to get your client barefoot, get them unshod, and have a look at them in a standing position. So get them to stand normally. I saw a guy this morning via an online consultation. So he was kind of like 2:45, never mind 2:50 in his foot placement. And he squatted like that, and he deadlifted like that. And interestingly, he had no problems in his knees or his hips. He was getting some lateral ankle impingements. So as his foot was rolling in, he was starting to nip the outside part of his ankle joints. So all we did with him was got him into that active stance position that we talked about in that podcast, Chris. So feet straight, imagining the foot's a tripod, and got him to squat, got him to deadlift. And it changed his pain experience instantly. I think sometimes it's as simple as that. I don't think you necessarily need to get involved in strengthening up posterior tibialis or quadratus plantaris. It can just be a minute adjustment, changing the foot position. That creates a better arch, and that creates better lower limb mechanics. I think sometimes it's as simple as that.
Yeah, we're very, very, very glad you've said that, because that from an application standpoint is what people need to hear. And I think that it is cool to, if you think about your big rocks as a PT, what do I really need to know? Well, first of all, just know how to communicate with people. Then I need to know about the exercises, and then as we're obviously getting higher and higher into minute anatomy, do I need to know it? Well, not necessarily, but like I say, is that Aaron could comfortably go through every single structure and explain why that worked. What you need to know is that worked, and that's the quick fix per se. But yeah, the thing that I would like 100% agree or add on to that is that everything must bear context, and sometimes too much of a good thing can be a bad thing as well. Don't get fixated on supination of the foot. Like, supination is something that we need 100%, and it's a healthy foot, but something that I probably not well, I shouldn't be diagnosed anyway, but not misdiagnosed, but would say, you really need to reinforce supination. Supination is just a stability mechanism during an eccentric phase of a movement, pronation is very important. It's not something that should be neglected, because without pronation, we can't push off anything. We can't squat, we can't deadlift, we can't run, walk. So being able to control pronation in tandem with the hip rotators is how we create force. So what people can do, and this is common in bodybuilders who do a lot of leg press, is they can just load that lateral arch, that lateral side of the foot around here with this little toe, and then suddenly just jam themselves in to a supinated position, get really, really good at that. But then they're going to get irritation in the peroneals, they're going to get irritation in the IT band, the medial glutes, and that's going to shove them into a further anterior tilt, which they probably got anyway for being a bodybuilder. So everything can add on to its, can add up.
The moral of that story is don't bodybuild, kids.
Yeah, don't bodybuild. It is cool. Let's get into the questions, because Sean's already gone ahead.
All right. So if a client has flat feet and their feet pronate on a squat, split squat, he's gone now. Let me get that back up again. Would it still be a good idea to directly train the anterior and posterior tibialis? Let's take that one, Chris.
Yeah, cool. So really it's with the anterior and posterior tibialis, it's like it's one of those like questions more about psychology. Is like how often do you see the client? If you've got them for 1 or 2 hours a week, do you want them to do tibialis stuff? And because it's the very little immediate benefit for the client, you might think, yes, I'm improving that, but the isolation movements really, I think, are important during rehabilitation. But the ultimate goal of any exercise is co-coordination between all the structures. So do you want them to try to do isolation movements? Yeah, maybe for a stimulus so they understand what it feels like, but you can take things a little bit too far out of context. I would rather see barefoot or minimal feet and minimal soles, so a thin shoe, and just teaching them what it feels like to create force from the ground, so to control themselves eccentrically and then push back up without the knees coming in. A lot of the time it's either the position of the exercise, it might be the level of they're unstable, so you could give them a more stable environment, or simply just work on body weight until it becomes natural. But if somebody had if they're pronating a lot, I'd say you're practicing the eccentric at a tempo, see what range they can work within, and then build up. But I wouldn't want to, I don't think, and this is through my own experience of working with people on the gym floor, I don't think the carryover is that great of doing direct tibialis work. I don't think it's like do loads of tibialis raises and suddenly all they've got to have a perception of how to control the foot whilst move their body in space and control the hip at the same time and whatever else they're doing with their arms. So.
Yeah, and I think I would add into that, Sean. I think you've got to remember people are coming to you on the whole as a PT because they want to, achieve their body goals or get fit, or there's either aesthetic or performance goals. And I think from an anterior tibialis, posterior tibialis perspective, you're going to be hard pushed to convince them this is achieving their either aesthetic or performance goal. And getting caught up in there. Now, I think what you can do is, again, like we talked about, look at the foot placement. If they're a 10 to 2er or a 5 to 1er, then try and get them into a straight foot position, because automatically that will raise the foot, that will create more of a medial longitudinal arch. And then unload them, so don't suddenly get them back into their squat, 160 kilo squat with that new straight foot position. Back off the load, teach them that new motor engram, and then start to reload back up. And you'll probably find that without even needing to touch posterior tibialis or anterior tibialis, you address the weakness in those muscles by correcting the foot position.
And yeah, as somebody who, again, my kind of, whatever you want, if you want to say an ethos as a PT, is that I want to make sure that people don't have to make the mistakes that I did. Now, I was able to retain clients because what I was doing sounded smart enough. So,
yeah.
Oh, right, yeah, okay, I need to train this muscle because I was good at delivering the information and they might have seen some benefit from it. But now I've come full circle and learn a little bit more. I would never want somebody to do direct banded tibialis work there and then as like an actual program exercise. I'd want the client to be working as hard as they can with what in their own capability. There are some times when someone can have knee pain and you do a little bit of METs, or you do like a banded set of 10 in a rest period, and suddenly it improves it. That 100% has its place, but my goal now would always be the person has to be doing stuff that they find challenging, but obviously they can stabilize throughout the whole movement. So should I be worried about bunions on the outside of the foot if I have them most of my life and currently running with no issues? Outside of my big toe, I've had them all my life, currently without any issues or history of issues.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think bunions per se aren't necessarily a problem. You know, a bunion that's painful, that becomes a problem. But a bunion is just an outgrowth of bone. So bone remodels in response to mechanical stress. I think it's called, is it Wolff's Law, Chris?
I'm not sure on that one, mate.
So Wolff's Law, this is the reason why you have a fracture, and as soon as you can weight bear on that fracture, you're weight bearing, because essentially load increases the structural integrity of that bone. It remodels in response to that stress. Now, a bunion is probably what you'd class as being an aberrant, an incorrect loading. You know, it's the side of your shoe rubbing on the side of the big toe. So in itself, it's not a problem. But the problem is with bunions is as that bunion develops, the big toe laterally deviates more, it starts to rotate. And there's two sesamoid bones that sit underneath your big toe. As those sesamoid bones rotate and get trapped between, can you see that on that model there, Chris?
Yeah, I'm just going to speak so it switches to me, and then if I zoom.
So if you look at Chris, if you come down a little bit, because so that's it. So if you look at the bottom of the big toe there, you can see there's two bony lumps. They're sesamoid bones, and they sit in the tendon of flexor Hallux Longus. Now, as the big toe rotates, those sesamoid bones get caught between the first toe and the second toe, and that's what causes the pain. So it's not the bunion per se, it's the rotation and the impingement on those bones, I suppose you'd call it. So no, I wouldn't worry about that. I think it was Liam, wasn't it, that posted that question?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think what you've got to be careful of, Liam, is if your big toe is starting to deviate laterally, you need to try and do some work to address that, because the sesamoid bones underneath will give you some pain if they take far enough round. And
you posted some awesome feet mobilization drills, didn't you, a couple of days ago? I think I saw a subtalar one.
Yes, yeah. We did some. My wife pestered me into doing something for the foot.
Yeah.
It's interesting on Instagram that there seems to be a big need for people to see lower back, necks. You know, the peripheral joints don't tend to get as much response from people. So yeah, we pepper them in now and again, but yeah, I don't like doing them because I don't get as many likes. It's not good for my ego.
It's not, no. Only do what's popular, Aaron. That's the number one rule of Instagram. You know that by now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think.
Go on, you're going to say, Chris.
I think one of the things as well is that, again, I don't want to go too much into it, but it's such a cool kind of mechanical system. But if you were to think of all these bones that are in here, if you look at this structure, there's so much going on, and they're specifically shaped. So when I rotate one way and then rotate the other way, the foot is supposed to lock in stability when it goes one direction and then unlock. And it's like this, it's like, if you imagine like a jigsaw puzzle where everything fits together nicely. And if you shake it, everything goes together, and then it needs to be able to shake it again, and then everything goes apart. Because it is such an intricate system which is held together by joints and tendons and everything. But with feet, maybe due to whatever popularity, whatever it is, I don't want to, well, I'll just say it because it's easy to say, but you're not going to change a lot with the feet. If you notice somebody on, who's in their 30s, the bony adaptations and the changes to the tendons and ligaments, you ain't going to change anytime soon. You can give them better strength and stability and stronger hips and stronger feet and stronger muscles all throughout that chain, 100%, and that will improve things. But there's certain things that, that's just the way they are. And when the bones have changed, so when these bones have changed anatomically, they now have different mechanics. So that's one thing that I would say is important, which is every single person you see is going to have individual foot mechanics based on their own life experiences, and probably different from the left to the right. So even though context is very, very key, is that if everyone comes through the door, and again, a mistake that I made, which I don't want anybody else to make, don't think that, you know, some standing on one leg and big toe exercises are going to suddenly mean they're going to be completely symmetrical, because as soon as there's a bony adaptation and a tendon adaptation, that's not changing anytime soon.
I think the question you've got to ask yourself is, have they got pain as a result of that foot position? You know, I think if they're pain-free, you know, it's like we talked about in that podcast, Chris, look at the Afro-Caribbean feet. You know, they're flat as plates in the majority of Afro-Caribbean athletes, yet very few of them struggle with knee pain, hip pain, big toe pain. And I think we've pathologized flat feet, and we've almost made it like, oh, your foot's flat, therefore you need to increase your arch, or you need an expensive pair of orthotics. And actually, as long as it's functional, I think you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing.
Because obviously I know I'm being recorded and know it's going on YouTube. I don't understand how that orthotics are so heavily prescribed in a certain way. I mean, don't get me wrong, everything's got its place, definitely, but considering how long do you have to study to it's
a 3-year degree, so it's the same, it's the same length of time as it would be to become a physiotherapist. I think the problem is, I think a lot of podiatry is very different to what I think where people are getting prescriptions from, and I don't want to turn this into some orthotic rants. We've done that already. But I think orthotics they're an easy way for people to make money, for therapists to make money out of clients. You spend £200 or £300 on a custom pair of orthotics, which offloads that structure that's hot and painful, and then you're loath to take them out your shoe because you just spent £200 or £300 on them. So I think what they're designed for is like a quick fix. They're designed to get you out of pain, so you can then start to rehab. They're not designed to be left in your shoes. You know, if we splint something, it gets weaker. And in this case, it's the foot, which is a pretty important part of your functional anatomy.
And if we think about the functional anatomy again, is that an orthotic prevents this structure from unlocking.
Yeah.
So if I was to shake it, and if I was to go outside to rotate the tibia and fibia or the talar joint laterally, that's going to lock all the bones. As I go medially, everything unlocks. You can't unlock if you've got sort of big an orthotic, which is providing pushing against it. Go back into the questions. Got quite a few.
So Rach is the next one. She's got webbed toes. Really struggled to move the big toe on one foot independent of the other toes. Any tips on training this as no impacts on my foot stability?
Well, Rach is a seasoned veteran of Anatomy Club, so we already know that she's got some joint issues as well in terms of hyperlaxicity. I'd say there's probably something stemming from that big toe is trying to protect something. So first of all, I might say we're careful what you mobilize, because it might be that they've webbed for a reason, and they've adapted because of something for an instability. Any thoughts on that, Aaron?
Yeah, so I think, Rach, I can't remember if we talked about this before on previous anatomy clubs. Ehlers-Danlos or Marfan's.
Yeah, we have, yeah.
Because webbed toes and hypermobility or hyperlaxicity are really common in Marfan syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. Now, personally, if I was going to improve your foot stability and reduce your risk of injury, I would be trying to make sure my midfoot and hindfoot were as mobile as possible. So I'm almost trying to overcompensate the lack of movement in your toes and making sure my midfoot and hindfoot. So that subtalar mode that Chris was talking about, which is on our Instagram feed, that will be good. Tennis ball on the bottom of your foot, strumming across the tendons to make sure the midfoot bones are all articulating properly. You know, that's an anatomical restriction that you're probably not going to change. However, if you make sure that the midfoot and hindfoot are working properly, you'll probably accommodate that restriction through the rest of your foot.
Cool. Going to the
if you want, come back to us if you let us know about your Marfans and your Ehlers-Danlos.
So flat foot, I've been struggling with ankle pain for years. I've been trying to build strength in my feet and arches, but when I lift my arches, I find this limits the range of ankle dorsiflexion in my ankle. Is this a matter of keep going, working on this ankle range until something else could help with this? Okay, so what there is that when we change, get me foot up. So when we increase the arch of the foot, so we increase the medial arch, we change the mechanism, so we're going to more of a supinated foot position, and that's good, but that shuts off dorsiflexion by default. We actually will increase dorsiflexion if we're able to slightly pronate. And it's a cheat that a lot of people do when they do the ankle test, is that they just massively, when we're doing like the ankle range of motion test, if I say, right, keep your knee over your middle toe like that, people will probably find the true range. Whereas if they go into pronation, they'll probably go really far. So what I'd say is that the body is adapted to be in pronation all the time, so it will be able to really improve it, so much so that when it goes into supination, it doesn't have this muscle strength to do that. In terms of what to do, is that I'd say that we were saying about your client you had this morning, Aaron, where he was so externally rotated that he was getting lateral impingement at the ankle. I'd say probably go with more the active foot stance again and work with that, what range you have, because that'll promote the the active foot and everything going forward. More so to strengthen the entire chain. I think, Hattie, as well, have you got a history of doing sumo deadlifts? So you're very, very attentive. No?
I can't go into the sumo deadlift position.
Right, okay.
But I do get pinching on the outside and the front of the ankle.
Outside and the front of the ankle, yeah. So that to me is if you could, I'd be really tempted to, from a treat yourself perspective, work on what's called the retinaculum of the ankle. I think that might give you some joy. Which is where you use the kind of knuckle of your little finger or something and scoop underneath and try and create some space. That might improve the plantar flexion, because contrary to what may think, is that by improving the ability to plantar flex, I think you probably make some room around that joint to go into a bit more dorsiflexion. But like I say, we've been a pretty big fan of it this talk, what active stance, because everything's got to try and fire in tandem.
Is that why I could be getting shin splints and things like that further up?
Yeah, that would make sense. Is because there's been some form of accommodation with with not being able to get into that position. And if you think of it from what shin splints are, is that you'll have because you're going into pronation, this tibialis, which is coming through this structure and into the medial part of the foot, might be constantly firing in some way, and the deeper structures might be firing as well to try and manage the foot position. So this is constantly working round here to bring the foot back this way when you're walking or running. So I think it's all interrelated. Mobilizing the feet and the ankle joint would help, but I would say working on, I'd probably go further up now and think about how you can stabilize through the glutes whilst getting the knee to track over the foot properly. Because somebody who is working on the feet quite a bit and not getting any joy, I'd be tempted to look further up and look at the hip stability. And the reason why the ankles won't mobilize is it doesn't trust the hip to stabilize. So.
Can I jump in there, Hattie? Have you had ankle sprains in the past before?
I had it on the opposite side. And then I got pain on the other side. I think I was compensating when running, and then it's gone back.
Yeah. So sometimes. And what's your joint mobility like generally? Are you quite mobile?
My knees are a bit high mobile.
So what might be worth doing is there's it's called a Mulligan's mobilization. So essentially what you're trying to do, it's a Mulligan's ankle mobilization. So you're trying to pull the talus posteriorly using a little thin resistance band.
Okay.
I think we've probably got one of these on our feed on Mofo Body Mechanics. Probably
Look at Mofo Foot.
Mofo Foot. Hashtag Mofo Foot. There'll be something on there. So what often happens is your talus, either because of laxity in the ligaments or because of the way that you've been walking, starts to migrate anteriorly.
Mm.
Because it's wider at the front and narrower at the back, it starts to limit ankle dorsiflexion. So what you find, your shin splints are because your anterior tibialis muscle is desperately trying to pull the foot into dorsiflexion. And because there's stiffness in the joint, that's where you're getting your shin splints.
Mm.
Your joint stiffness, anterior tibialis will settle down, your shin splints will settle down, and you'll be able to then start to create a better ankle dorsiflexion, which will help them with your flat-footed, you know, your attempt to try and build strength in the muscles. So
Yeah.
Mulligan's mobilization on your talus.
Okay.
I'll see if I'm pretty sure there's one on our feed. And then you're on Instagram. You just drop us a DM if you're struggling with anything. And then we'll.
Yeah, it's been really frustrating for the last couple of years because I'm trying to get back to my running. I'm supposed to be running London in October if it's going to go ahead. But yeah, it's just.
Yeah, I think like Chris said, an active foot stance. So standing in a straight foot position, your foot's a tripod, and then this talus mobilization, this Mulligan's talus mobilization. That would be the easy way for you to address your dorsiflexion restrictions.
I guess that would make sense in terms of my split squat is actually stronger than my normal squat. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and is it stronger on the right leg or the left leg? Sprained or the non?
None, I'd say.
So the non-sprained side, which would make sense because it's the better joint stability in that position. Yeah, try that.
So that's the one that's a tighter ankle.
Yeah. And it's tight, and that's what's limiting dorsiflexion. That's where your anterior tibialis is having to work hard to try and pull it into flex position. Yeah. Try those.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, so we're going to go for Sean's. One for the forearms. Client gets pain and limitation in forearm when pronating, particularly on bicep curls. Face pulls and turning a dumbbell when getting into a chest press. So going into pronation, which is going to be going like that. Immediately, the muscles, whether they're exactly the muscles that are going on there, I'll be looking at the extensors. And if we're looking at the Extensor Carpi group, we want to look around that region, which Sean is going to be, if I go with my elbow here, we're on lateral epicondyle, run round here, a good amount that guy has got some issues going around that region. If obviously you're still in contact with him now, you'd want a trigger point just to get him to trigger point around this region in the extensors, and then just to pronate his hand, supinate his hand as well, just going through. Because if the inability to pronate is a lack of maybe strength or restriction in supination, because the forearm flexors have got to pull the hand round as the extensors can lengthen. So length tension round this region, get a lacrosse ball, and then just practice his supination. But because he's getting an issue further up the chain into the upper arm and into the shoulder, I would try a change a light bulb dance type of thing, where you're holding onto either the floor or onto the wall like that, and you can create some stability in the big finger. The index finger is onto the wall, and then what you want to try and get to do is you go into unscrewing and screwing the arm whilst keeping the hand in a fixed position. What that's doing is, even though the hand is in a fixed position, by rotating your shoulder, going from retraction to protraction, that's still supination and pronation, which you can't see, if that makes sense. You're still training them and lengthening them, especially as you protract. You'll be lengthening them, and as you retract, you'll be shortening them, and that's integrating some shoulder stability work whilst they're rotating. So it'll be trigger point to there. My favourite from a treatment perspective is the fascia tool. So if it's really bugging him, you can get a gua sha tool, which is about 10 quid on Amazon, and just scrape it yourself, which I think it's a pretty safe self-application treatment, I'd say. What do you think, Aaron?
I wonder whether or not it's supination rather than pronation.
Okay.
Bicep curls. So I wonder whether or not it's more of a distal bicep tendon problem. But yeah, I think if it's lateral epicondylitis, if it's lateral elbow pain, then absolutely, as you said, trigger points. I just wonder, Sean, if you mean supination rather than pronation. I've just been trying to lift dumbbells onto my chest. Imagine I've got some dumbbells kicking them back onto chest press. And it's more of a supination movement than it is a pronation. So I wonder if it's just an error in terminology.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly as you said.
Sweet. So anybody, again, I know we've gone past 3 o'clock, anybody needs to shoot. We'll just take these last 2 questions from John and from Jimmy. Would you say everyone who bilaterally squats should aim for a neutral foot position to improve foot mechanics, or rather than deviating from 10 to 2? That's a really good question. I like that question. Thanks, John.
We could do an hour-long podcast on that.
Oh, right. If you've got to shoot, then you can get off. Don't worry about it. That's a really, really good question.
I would say yes.
So when you go 10 to 2, so everybody's got a different shape pelvis, everybody's got a different shape inclination of the femoral head, everybody's got a different shape everything to a degree. So someone came along in powerlifting and said, right, it's a really good idea to create hip stability. But what they've done is when you deviate outwards, when you go into external rotation of the foot and anterior tilt the pelvis, you've compressed the anterior fibers of the medial glutes, which means that as you go into that external rotation, you create tons and tons of stability in the hip. So it feels really stable. What happens is, depending on your anatomy, you'll either hit an end range in the ability to keep a neutral spine and so have to go into flexion, or you'll cheat and go a little bit wider so you actually hit depth by default or just lean forward. All this is changing your lower back mechanics. So in terms of that really heavily externally rotated position, the reason why we favour it is because we can lift more weight and we can cheat and use a more of a back extension position than actually using our quads. If you squat a lot, you should have big quads. If you don't, then you're not using your quads. You're probably cheating somehow. So you're probably using like glutes, lower back, whatever. If you're a power lifter, you're probably going to have to squat at 10 and 2 just to lift the same amount of weight as the other guys, just to keep up with them. So you need to keep those mechanics in. However, what I'd love to start seeing is a lot of powerlifters offsetting it with a much narrower stance, more active foot neutral position, where the feet can run forward, so the knees, can track parallel in front of them. So they have that nice distribution between medial and lateral quad development. In terms of your everyday population client, so your general population, if somebody sits down at a desk all day, the wider and more externally rotated you go with their feet, I think the more chance you're gonna encounter some lower back issues further down the line. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I think powerlifters aside, because they're a specialist population. So I think we'll take the powerlifters out of the equation. Unless you're working with performance athletes, I would be encouraging everybody to try and adopt a neutral foot or an active foot position, primarily because it allows you to screw your feet into the floor and create torque and tension up in the external rotators of the hip, which then acts as a force closure mechanism on your pelvis. So you're actually protecting your lower back by keeping your feet straight. The reasons people can't do this is that because they've got limitations in ankle dorsiflexion, so they've got some restriction in the movement of the ankle, or they've got restrictions at the hips. And I think if they can't do that, then some of their accessory movements, you might get them to allow them in the first instance to squat at 10 to 2, but in the background, what you're doing is adding in some mobility stuff into the routine to try and improve either hip or ankle range of movements, and then gradually bring them back into that straight foot position. Powerlifters are different because it's super physiological loads. I think there's a lot of stuff that goes on in powerlifting that probably isn't technically as we'd like to see it, but needs is needs must when you're lifting 400 kilos for a squat.
Mm-hmm. There's a quick one before I get to Jimmy's, is about squatting barefoot. Lunging barefoot, more than happy with that. Squatting barefoot, that's another rabbit hole one. But neutral foot position for deadlift. Yes, I would. Same with deadlift, but with probably a narrower stance, just slightly. But with squatting, I'd have to go further into it because I will go too far down the rabbit hole. But me and Aaron might actually disagree with this. But squatting barefoot, you've got to be really, really careful, because if somebody hits their limitation of ankle dorsiflexion, so let's just say we're here and they've gone forward and they don't have that ability to dorsiflex that level and they're round about here, if we go further up, they might only be about, way, way above parallel, just because they don't either have the physiological ability, so the anatomical ability, or the strength to get any further. So because they want to please you and because they want to just do the movement, they'll then accommodate with massive amounts of lumbar flexion. And even though it may seem good, like barefoot squatting with no load, knock yourself out, do as much as that's how we're supposed to be. But we weren't designed to squat ass to grass with hundreds of kilos on our back. So if you want to do barefoot with no load, 100%, with load, it's a different story. And to add on to that is that when I was rehabbing myself, I spent ages and ages and ages squatting barefoot and doing pause squats barefoot with no heel raise. It was a safety bar squat. I was doing a squat every day program because that's the smartest thing to do. And I was going down into this bottom of the squat position with 170 kilos in the back, paused into the bottom, and my lower back completely blew out on me, completely. And it was like complete, and what I'd done is this is how I know this, not from anatomy books, this is how I know it. So I'm right at the bottom of this squat, lower back's completely blown out, that feeling, that panic that you get, if you've ever done it where you think that's just popped. But because it's a safety bar, I can't throw it off me. So I'm sat at the bottom of this squat barefoot because I've taken my lumbar spine into so much flexion. I was like, well, there's only one way of doing this. It's got to go back up. So I had to squat it back up, and that wasn't really pleasant. And that took a lot of bracing intra-abdominal pressure, put it back in. And so I learned that the hard way is that, everybody dependent on their anatomy will eventually, because I was trying to squat beyond what my body would allow me to. So I'd gone into so much lumbar flexion. Now, if you think about the ligaments and the disc pressure, 170 kilos is now going through each one of those discs to a degree in a flex position because I was barefoot. If I'd raised my heels by about, an inch or two, I wouldn't have encountered that problem. So barefoot squatting is good in theory, but please be careful because it's not pleasant. Finally, wrist extension on the right-hand side feels grim during lockdown, the back of the hand. I really like a rocking movement with that one, Jimmy. So you've got your palm of your hand here, going over and then going back. So it's like a quadruped rocking movement. I'm giving that to a lot of clients, and you want to basically improve the flexion. So you want to improve the length tension of the forearm flexors and just easing into it. You don't want to do anything where your palm of your hand's coming up where there's any irritation, but you're just doing that and doing the 25 minutes with, you're probably at your desk quite a bit doing a lot of work. No longer than 25 minutes sitting without getting up and doing that extension. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was almost unable to sit down and do 10 minutes worth of typing because the pain in my wrist here, pain in my forearm there was so painful from the volume of typing. So please look after that wrist extension.
You could add in a band, Jimmy. So if you get a little red resistance band and add some distraction onto the joint. So do exactly what Chris just said, that sort of quadruped rocking, but attach a resistance band. So essentially a resistance band, let me just try and bring my hand into the right view. The resistance band is pulling your radius and ulna posteriorly, and that will improve wrist extension. So red resistance band, very much like the Mulligans, things that we talked about with Hattie. And again, I think I've done something like this on the gram, so you can probably find that somewhere on there. And I agree with you, Chris. Barefoot for squatting, yeah, I wouldn't do that. You need to keep your shin vertical. So if you can't squat keeping your shin vertical barefoot, then you shouldn't be squatting barefoot with load.
And again, there's so many different things that make sense logically. We've got our first animal fan of the anatomy club. We've never known a cat wanting to actually upskill itself when it comes to anatomy. That's amazing. So unfortunately there's some things that do just would make sense in your head, like I just need to, barefoot squatting, and I'll openly admit I've had clients barefoot squatting. No one ever got up to the loads, very heavy loads, because in your theory it's like, yeah, I need to be primal, need to do something like this, but dig a bit deeper. What we really want to do with any type of lower body mechanics is mimic gait mechanics, so walking mechanics, as closely as we can, in my opinion. I think that's one of the most functional ways of training people, is to try and mimic that propulsion strategy of walking and running. So that's what we do. And anything where you don't walk with a deviated foot external. Well, some people do as an adaptation, but that's not the most efficient way of running. We want to make sure we're rolling through in that proper heel strike, then onto the outside, into the big toe, and then push off and triple extend through all the joints. That's what we want to try and promote. So that's why Aaron's going about active foot, because essentially that is a bilateral mechanics of walking. We're just doing it at the same time rather than unilaterally doing that. But yeah, anyway, we'll leave it there, guys, because obviously I know a lot of people, it's a beautiful day and a lot of people got other stuff to do. That cat's got a real good stare going on at the moment.
I'll bring my three-legged cat on next week. You can marvel at a uneven pelvis.
You got a three-legged cat?
You got a three-legged cat. Yeah, she got hit by a car.
Oh no.
About 6 months old, and the vet said they actually do really well if we amputate the leg. They actually start to compensate. So she now, when she runs, you know she's got 3 legs. She looks like she's 4-legged. When she walks around the house, she goes as her back leg contacts the floor. Yeah. Some appearances in my videos. A few people have commented. I think I did a wonky pelvis video, and somebody commented and said, "What about the cat's wonky pelvis? What can you do for that?" Short of growing another limb, nothing.
Well, there you go. I've never come across that before.
I'll bring her on next week. We'll have a guest appearance.
That'd be amazing. I'd really like to see that, the wonky cat appearance. Right, guys, I'll finish the